Yes, I'm still kicking. If you've been following my stuff, you know I much prefer to do feature-length pieces, where I can really get into the details of a topic. Feature videos, of course, take time to make, and I just haven't had the time available to me lately. But now that my workload is relaxed some, I expect to be back into more consistent production. Hope you can hang with me. I'm also kicking around the idea of producing some shorts too. 5-minute or so spots that are interesting and useful and serve to let you all know I'm alive and kicking. My son has even suggested that I tell some good fishing stories. Stories that illustrate some useful things I've learned along the way, and are entertaining to boot. My son enjoys YouTube story channels and tells me they don't need to be image heavy, just interesting and relevant. Let me know what you think. My main thrust remains my documentary production, followed by feature pieces on important topics. Topics that support access to and participation in the aquatic world. A world that's mostly hidden from us, both visually and in terms of interpretation of what's really going on down there. Those interactions that can both inform us in our fishing and entertain us. Again, let me know what you think of some shorter pieces. I'm happy to take short topic suggestions, although I can tell you I'm not necessarily in need of inspiration. I have it in droves. Alright, in this video we're going to hit fishing lines once again. This time to share how I use the different lines in my own fishing, the rigging I use for various presentation types. I can tell you that it's been killing me that it's taken this long to get out what I feel is needed to know about fishing lines before we get to the meat and potatoes, the cool stuff in my mind, the nitty-gritty of getting fish to bite, and that's presentation. In my fishing, I regularly use all three major line types, nylon and fluorocarbon monofilaments and the multi-filament braids. With my casting reels that don't allow me to readily change spools and change lines, I designate reels for certain jobs. Most of my casting reels contain braid with a mono leader. A braid and leader setup provides both the ability to change lines at the business end of things and provides an exceptionally low maintenance setup. Braid is essentially impervious to sunlight degradation, and the mono leader affords that abrasion resistance that we need. I also keep a couple of casting reels designated as crankbait or topwater reels, spooled with usually with nylon monos. One is for the early season with lighter, thinner mono for those clear water conditions so commonly seen in natural lakes and ponds during the early season. And then another reel with thicker, heavier mono for the mid and late seasons when the aquatic vegetation grows up and gets dense. As to spinning reels, when I buy a new reel, I also buy extra spools. Thus I can switch between different lines off the same reel. Nowadays, with the advent of braids, though, many anglers choose to simply fill their single spool with braid and run various mono leaders off of that. I also do that. However, braid is often at its worst in windy conditions due to its low mass and softness, which hinders presentation and detection. I like braid for calmer conditions, though, for the very same reasons, for its low mass and softness, plus for its buoyancy. I keep spools with straight fluorocarbon too if I'm in for windy conditions, because fluorocarbon's density bucks wind better both in the air and on the water by dropping beneath the surface film currents that are created by the wind. Just as a heads up, fluorocarbons in general can present a challenge to anglers because of their stiffness, especially in thicker diameters. They don't lay down on the spool well, are apt to have loops pop up with any slack. Fluorocarbons don't handle line twist well and can be just a nightmare to fish with. Now, I haven't used all the fluorocarbons out there, and there's new stuff coming out all the time, so keep your ear to the ground. Many manufacturers recommend that for spinning tackle we use fluorocarbon lines under about 13 thousandths of an inch, about 12 or 14 pound test when using spinning tackle. At this threshold diameter, most anglers tend to use braided lines behind a fluorocarbon leader or go to casting gear or both. Spinning reel spool diameter matters here especially. And when considering a new spinning reel, spool diameter is a primary consideration. On all my spinning reels, I look for those with large spool diameters or simply go up in reel size, even for my ultralight rods. Okay, let's roll through some presentation lure types and talk about rigging. For topwaters, I use nylon monos because of their buoyancy, which allows topwater lures to operate freely. Braid is the most buoyant of lines, but it's so soft that it has the habit of tangling treble hooks, the treble hook on many topwaters, either on the cast or during the retrieve. So the addition of a nylon mono leader is important here. The stretch offered by nylon monos is often mentioned as an advantage for treble hook lures in helping keep such relatively small gap hooks from tearing out of hooked fish. I haven't found this to be much of an issue for me. I also at times may use barbless hooks, even on trebled lures, and I actually prefer more rigid rods for this. It appears that what's important, especially so with barbless hooks, is keeping adequate tension on those fish during the fight. Softer rods do not respond as quickly to the fish's antics and can induce slack a lot more easily. For hard jerkbaits, I use both types of monos, nylons and fluorocarbons. Nylon for its buoyancy in shallow waters, and fluorocarbon for its density for deeper water. Also in windy conditions, the density of fluorocarbon helps buck wind a bit better, both in the air and on the water by sinking below the surface film currents that can create a bow in the line, affecting presentation and detection. I fish jerks both shallow, often above vegetation, and deep. Nylon's buoyancy helps keep that jerk shallow, and when fishing them deeper, fluorocarbons help in terms of detection sensitivity, not to any inherent vibration transmission abilities, but because it sinks, reducing the bow in the line, again created by the surface film and the water's viscosity, its thickness. For shallow crankbaits, I use nylon monos mostly for the buoyancy that allows the line to float on the surface for strike detection during calmer surface conditions. I vary my retrieve a lot with cranks to trigger strikes, and we'll hit this heavy in a coming video on presentation. And as a part of this varying retrieve, I'll often pause the lure. I then will lay the line on the water's surface, draw it slightly tense, and watch it like a hawk. If a fish takes, the line will twitch or skate. There's one. The pause is a great trigger, and a line that floats offers really great detection. With deep cranks, I use either nylons or fluorocarbon monos, often going with fluorocarbons for their density. If I really need depth, I'll wait and let that fluorocarbon line sink before I begin the retrieve. Wind, in general, is less an issue with diving plugs since they tend to draw the line under the surface film anyway. It ends up breaking the surface film and going down with the plug. For lipless cranks, I generally use monos. However, I'll also use anything on my reel at the moment because lipless cranks have such great bite triggering abilities. I almost always have them with me. So I'm apt to use one at any time. Lipless cranks, because of their density, are also more apt to allow hooked fish to shake the hooks. So hook size and quality matters here, in particular, as does keeping the line appropriately taut when fighting the fish. I do not use barbless hooks on lipless cranks. But again, I don't like too soft a rod, especially when matched with a slow reel, because slack needs to be kept in immediate check, or the fish can loose the lure with a toss of its head. My preferred lipless outfit is a fast casting reel, a rigid rod, and nylon monos. Nylon monos, their buoyancy helps keep these snag magnets able to be lifted above danger with each lift of the rod or acceleration of the reel. Since mono is buoyant, it tends to pull lures upward. And that's a help in dangerous water. Weedless topwaters, so-called frogs, are generally used for heavy surface cover, stuff you can't get into with almost any other lure. Frogs can work in open water too. However, I much prefer treble hook topwaters in open water because of their much better hooking abilities. Frogs and weedless topwaters tend to call for heavy tackle, heavy braid, because of the density of the cover and the bass's ability to just burrow down into it after hookup. When bass are spooked, they tend to hide. Short mono leaders are a good idea as well for their abrasion resistance. Braid will fray when drawn against cover and is expensive stuff. Better to let an inexpensive piece of mono take on that abuse. For spinnerbaits and bladed jigs, I pretty much lump them together. Because they all sport pretty large hooks, I'll use any line type. There are advantages, though, in using braid with a mono leader when fishing spinnerbaits shallow, which I often do. Since spinnerbaits trigger strikes so well, especially when fished at speed, one can cover a lot of water with them. So I'll often make long bombing casts, and I often wake or bulge them, as I call it, just under the water's surface. And it helps to have a buoyant line when trying to do this. Same with buzzbaits, which are fished in essentially the same way. When fishing spinnerbaits, deeper though, say for slow rolling, I like the added density of fluorocarbon. These lures are pretty weedless, and it's fine to have a sinking line ahead of them. Okay, mega lures, the big stuff, swim baits, musky-sized, saltwater-sized lures. I learned long ago that you almost can't throw something too big for a motivated bass to try and handle. This doesn't mean everywhere, every time. Little in bass fishing does. However, if you want a good crack at breaking a personal best or a pond record, going big can tip probabilities in your favor. For such lures, I tend to use heavier braids with a leader, although in the past I've done well with mono too. The only thing is not to go too light in line diameter. Match the line to both the lure weight and the hook wire diameter. Fishing those heavy lures will test your line and knots all by themselves, with or without some big fish thrown in. I fish jigs a lot, and here I'll lump them all together to include about anything you can hang on a jig head. This is because all jigs are mostly subsurface lures that we manipulate to provide the action and triggering. Here I fish either braid with a mono leader or straight fluorocarbon. The latter for deeper presentations and in wind, as already described. With braids, I may use either a nylon or fluorocarbon leader. Short leaders for maintenance purposes, that is abrasion resistance that straight braid just doesn't have, and longer leaders for deeper water. Again, if I'm apt to be confronted by strong winds or some serious depth, I may go to straight fluorocarbon. Okay, soft plastics. We can lump most soft plastics with jigs, especially those fished on a jig head or fished like a jig. And I fish them all on pretty much the same lines. However, I'll get a bit more specific about my rigging here because of soft plastic's unique property of being so soft and spongy that bass will often hold them longer than they will other lure types. We'll focus on plastic worms since they're such a staple. And many other soft plastic lures can be fished in similar ways. I use worms in four main ways. Texas rigging, as a swimming worm, stick worms, and via drop shot rig. I use Texas rigging when confronted with dense cover, and these are fished with a similar line setup as I'd use for heavy cover jigs, usually braid with a leader for its low stretch hook setting abilities and for its ability to slice through vegetation. Braided lines have a tendency to slice deeply into wet wood though, so around wood cover I'm apt to go to straight mono. I use a swimming worm a lot, usually with a lightly weighted T-rig for swimming around and often over shallow cover and or sighted fish. Here I use the same rigging as for mid to lighter weight jigs, usually braid with a leader. A braid lands quietly on the water, important for shallow and sighted fish, and offers excellent hook setting, especially important with T-rig baits. I use stick worms especially for spooky or sighted fish, most often fished wacky rigged. Stick worms are unique. They have very unique attraction and triggering abilities, which pretty much everybody's discovered. They're one of the few lures that simply spells food to bass, rather than the lure having to do any special triggering motions. Apparently what's so attractive to bass is that cigar shape, coupled with soft plastic's ability to wriggle and twitch, suggesting life. Again, I use a braid and leader rig. Braid lands nearly silently on the water, and it floats for excellent strike detection on a calm water surface. My shallow water stickworm rig consists of a minimum of about 20-pound braid, or about 10/1000ths, or 0.25 millimeters, for its buoyancy and visibility on the water surface, to which I add a short mono leader of, say, 3 to 5 feet. This rig prioritizes stealth and strike detection. The stickworm, nearly on its own, pretty much takes care of the rest. Although there are helpful manipulations we can use, mostly all I have to do is detect takes and time the hook set. The concern here is hooking the bass too deeply, as bass can fully ingest lightly or unweighted soft plastics completely. I also use stickworms on finesse tackle, usually the little 4-inch versions. Here I rig much like I would with finesse jigs, usually with light braid and a mono leader. The length of the leader dependent on the water depth. I tend to use nylon monos here because of the stickworm's attraction as it falls down through the water column. It's not generally a lure that's retrieved. Buoyant nylons slow that fall rate and keep the line above it, kind of parachuting above it, which offers strike detection, at least in shallow water. In deeper water, we must detect by feel. So I may go to a long fluorocarbon leader, or at this point I may switch to a faster sinking rig, such as a jig head and worm, or what's now called a shaky rig. It was always known as a jig worm back in the day. I also may go to a drop shot rig in deeper water. I do use drop shot rigging quite a bit, especially under conditions when fish are spooky and the motions of the lure and line during the retrieve can be expected to alarm fish. If you're casting and retrieving, especially under bright, high visibility conditions, and you can't buy a bite, it's very likely you are simply spooking everybody between your rod tip and the lure splashdown. Drop shot rigging allows a bait to sit in place and provide subtle weightless action with minimal movement of the line or the weight. You can drop shot with any diameter line. Heavy stuff is called Bubba shotting. You can look that up. And it can allow you to fish a weightless bait in and around heavy cover. Most often, though, drop shotting is used as a medium to finesse technique and often as a deep water technique. I use either braid with a short leader in shallow water or a long fluorocarbon leader in deeper water, or even going to straight fluorocarbon in deep water. Okay, unless I'm forgetting stuff, and I probably am, that should cover the rigging I use in a lot of my bass fishing. If you have rigs you like or thoughts on rigging, tell us about them. Anglers come up against all kinds of conditions and circumstances out there and have had to figure out ways to deal. So feel free to share if you're so inclined. We could all benefit. All right, until next time, and hopefully not too far in the future, we'll tackle presentation. Since I've been a small water angler for quite some time now, finding the bass isn't always the primary requirement for a successful day's catching in these small waters. Heck, I mean, the bass are there right in front of me with nowhere to go that's not a cast away. Instead, catching often means getting them to bite, and that's what presentation is all about.